The Cartographer's Final Survey. A Miss Marple mystery as narrated by Connor. Welcome back to the world of Miss Jane Marple, where keen observation meets gentle wisdom. I'm Connor, and today we find ourselves in the autumn of 1962, within the hallowed halls of the British Ordnance Survey headquarters in Southampton. The leaves outside were turning that particular shade of amber that speaks of change, and inside, the finest cartographers in Britain were gathering for their annual symposium. Chapter 1: The Annual Gathering. Miss Marple had arrived quite by accident, if one believes in such things. Her great-nephew Raymond worked as a junior surveyor, and a sudden bout of influenza had prevented his aunt from London from attending as his guest. "Aunt Jane," he had said over the telephone, "you've always been curious about maps. Would you care to take Aunt Millicent's place? The lectures might bore you, but the tea is excellent." And so Miss Marple found herself in the oak-panelled library of Ordnance House, surrounded by men in tweed jackets discussing theodolites and triangulation with a passion others reserved for cricket scores. She settled into a comfortable chair near the window, her knitting bag at her side, observing the gathering with the gentle interest she brought to all human endeavors. The room hummed with professional camaraderie, but Miss Marple's trained eye noticed the subtle undercurrents that flowed beneath the surface of polite conversation. In her years of watching village life, she had learned that the most civilized gatherings often harbored the deepest tensions. Dr. Edmund Fairweather, the chief cartographer, commanded the room's attention as he moved between groups. A distinguished man of 65 with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, he spoke with quiet confidence about the upcoming transition to modern surveying techniques. Miss Marple noticed how his eyes lingered on certain faces in the crowd, particularly on those of his potential successors. "The old ways are changing," Dr. Fairweather was saying to a small group near the fireplace. "But accuracy remains our highest calling. The nation depends on our precision." Among those listening was Margaret Thornfield, the department's first female senior cartographer. A capable woman in her early 40s, she held herself with the careful dignity of someone who had fought for every advancement. Miss Marple observed how Miss Thornfield's fingers drummed silently against her teacup when Dr. Fairweather spoke of modern methods, a gesture that suggested barely contained impatience. "Indeed, Dr. Fairweather," Miss Thornfield replied, her voice carrying just a hint of steel beneath its cultured tones. "Though I wonder if some of our methods might be more modern than others realize." Near the window, young Timothy Ashford, Raymond's colleague and barely 30, fidgeted with his pipe as he listened to the senior staff. Miss Marple noted how his eyes darted frequently toward the door, as if he were eager to escape. When Dr. Fairweather's gaze fell upon him, Timothy's face flushed slightly. "Nervous energy," Miss Marple murmured to herself, recognizing the signs from numerous church committee meetings. "The question is whether it's guilt or simply ambition." The department's treasurer, Mr. Charles Wainwright, stood somewhat apart from the others, his ledger tucked under his arm like a shield. A thin, precise man with wire-rimmed spectacles, he had the pale complexion of someone who spent more time with numbers than with sunlight. Miss Marple noticed how his gaze followed Dr. Fairweather with particular intensity, and how his jaw tightened whenever the chief cartographer mentioned the department's bright financial future. Money troubles, she reflected, thinking of similar expressions she'd seen on the faces of St. Mary Mead shopkeepers during difficult times. There's always money troubles when men look at their leaders that way. The room's dynamics shifted as Professor Henry Blackwood entered, his walking stick tapping against the polished floor. The emeritus head of cartographic studies at Oxford, he had trained half the men in the room during his decades of teaching. Now in his 70s, with a magnificent white beard and eyes that missed nothing, he moved through the gathering like a patriarch surveying his extended family. Fairweather, Professor Blackwood called out, his voice carrying the authority of the lecture hall. I trust you're prepared for tomorrow's presentation on the new coastal surveys? The Ministry is sending observers, I understand. Quite prepared, Professor, Dr. Fairweather replied, though Miss Marple noticed a slight stiffness in his posture. The accuracy improvements are remarkable. We'll be setting new standards for the entire Commonwealth. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to David Pemberton, the head of field operations, who had been quietly nursing his whiskey in the corner. A weathered man in his 50s with the deep tan of someone who spent his days outdoors, he looked distinctly uncomfortable in the formal setting. When Professor Blackwood mentioned the Ministry observers, Pemberton's grip tightened noticeably on his glass. Standards, Pemberton muttered, just loud enough for Miss Marple to hear. Some standards matter more than others, I suppose. The final member of the senior staff present was Dr. Alice Meridian, the department's chief technical officer. A brilliant woman in her late 30s with prematurely grey hair and ink-stained fingers, she had revolutionized the department's printing processes. Miss Marple watched as Dr. Meridian's attention drifted repeatedly to a leather portfolio she kept close at hand, treating it with the careful attention one might give to a sleeping infant. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple observed the intricate dance of professional relationships. There were alliances and rivalries, mentorships and competitions, all played out with the subtle maneuvering she knew so well from decades of village life. But there was something else, an undercurrent of tension that seemed to center on Dr. Fairweather himself. Such a lovely gathering, Miss Marple remarked to Raymond when he stopped by her chair. Everyone seemed so dedicated to their work. Oh yes, Aunt Jane. This department is Dr. Fairweather's pride and joy. He's transformed it completely in the past 5 years. Though I suppose change always makes some people uncomfortable. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her needles clicking softly as she worked on her knitting. Change indeed. In her experience, it was often the prospect of change, or the fear of exposure it might bring, that drove people to desperate measures. As she watched Dr. Fairweather hold court near the fireplace, she couldn't shake the feeling that beneath the cordial atmosphere of the annual gathering, something significant was building toward a crisis. The afternoon light was beginning to fade when Dr. Fairweather called for attention. Ladies and gentlemen, if I might have a moment. Tomorrow's presentation will mark a milestone for our department. The new survey methods we've developed will revolutionize British cartography. I wanted to thank each of you for your contributions to this achievement. As he spoke, Miss Marple noticed the various reactions around the room. Miss Thornfield's smile seemed rather forced. Mr. Wainwright appeared to study his ledger with sudden intensity. Young Timothy Ashford stared into his teacup as if reading tea leaves. Most intriguingly, Dr. Meridian's hand moved protectively toward her portfolio when Dr. Fairweather mentioned their revolutionary methods. The future of British surveying will be built on absolute precision and unshakable integrity, Dr. Fairweather concluded. Standards that will serve the nation for generations to come. Professor Blackwood raised his glass. To standards and integrity, then. May they always guide our work. As the others echoed the toast, Miss Marple continued her quiet knitting, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. In her long experience, she had learned that when people spoke most loudly about integrity, it was often because integrity was precisely what was at stake. And in a room full of people whose profession depended on absolute accuracy, even the smallest deception could have the most serious consequences. The gathering began to disperse as servants lit the lamps against the gathering dusk. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, reflecting on the currents of tension she had observed. Tomorrow would bring the formal presentations, but she suspected it might bring something else as well. In her experience, when people gathered to celebrate achievements while harboring such obvious anxieties, the celebration rarely proceeded as planned. As she prepared to leave, she overheard Dr. Fairweather speaking quietly to Professor Blackwood near the library door. "Everything is in order for tomorrow, Henry. The Ministry will see that British cartography stands second to none. I'm sure they will, Edmund. Though I confess, some recent rumours have reached me about irregularities in the coastal survey data. Nothing specific, you understand, but perhaps worth investigating. Miss Marple saw Dr. Fairweather's face go pale in the lamplight. Rumours, Professor? From what source? Oh, you know how these things spread. Academic gossip, most likely. But in our profession, accuracy is everything. Even the appearance of impropriety. Of course. I'll look into it immediately. As Miss Marple walked toward the door, she reflected that tomorrow's presentation might indeed prove more eventful than anyone anticipated. In her experience, when distinguished gentlemen grew pale at the mention of irregularities, those irregularities were rarely as minor as they claimed. The stage was set, the players assembled, and Miss Marple's instincts suggested that the annual symposium was about to become far more memorable than its organizers had intended. Chapter 2: When Precision Meets Suspicion. The next morning dawned crisp and clear over Southampton, the kind of October day that makes one grateful for the changing seasons. Miss Marple arrived at Ordnance House early, preferring to settle herself with a cup of tea before the day's presentations began. The building seemed different in the morning light, more formal, more imposing, as if it too were preparing for the scrutiny of the Ministry observers. Connor knew that Miss Marple had always possessed an uncanny ability to sense when trouble was brewing, and this morning, that familiar intuition was working overtime. As she made her way to the presentation hall, she observed the staff preparing for their distinguished visitors with a nervous energy that seemed to exceed ordinary professional anxiety. The main hall had been transformed overnight. Charts and maps covered every available surface, displaying the department's finest work. At the center of the room stood Dr. Fairweather's pride and joy, a massive relief map of the British coastline, complete with the latest survey data that would form the centerpiece of his presentation. Miss Marple found a seat in the back row, her knitting bag discreetly placed beside her. From this vantage point, she could observe both the presenters and the audience, including the three stern-faced gentlemen from the Ministry who had taken seats in the front row. Dr. Fairweather appeared at the podium, immaculate in his best suit, but Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he arranged his notes. The previous evening's conversation with Professor Blackwood had clearly affected him more than he cared to admit. "Gentlemen," Dr. Fairweather began, his voice carrying well through the hall, "today marks a new chapter in British cartographic excellence. The Coastal Survey project represents 5 years of meticulous work, employing the most advanced techniques available to modern science." As he spoke, Miss Marple observed the faces of his colleagues. Miss Thornfield sat rigidly upright, her attention focused not on Dr. Fairweather but on the Ministry observers. Mr. Wainwright kept consulting his pocket watch, as if timing something. Young Timothy Ashford seemed to be holding his breath. Most intriguingly, Dr. Meridian was absent from her usual seat in the front row. Miss Marple spotted her near the side door, her precious portfolio clutched tightly, her face pale with what appeared to be genuine distress. 20 minutes into the presentation, Professor Blackwood rose from his seat. The timing seemed deliberate. Dr. Fairweather had just begun explaining the revolutionary accuracy of their new coastal measurements. "Edmund," Professor Blackwood interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of decades in academia, "I wonder if you might address the question of data verification. In light of certain concerns that have come to my attention." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Dr. Fairweather's face went white, then flushed red. "Professor, I'm not sure this is the appropriate venue for." On the contrary, one of the Ministry observers interjected, rising from his seat. "We are very interested in hearing about any verification concerns. The Crown's mapping services must be above reproach." Miss Marple noticed how the various department members reacted to this exchange. Miss Thornfield's eyes glittered with what might have been satisfaction. Mr. Wainwright was now frankly staring at Dr. Fairweather with an expression Miss Marple recognized from countless village meetings, the look of someone waiting for a long-anticipated reckoning. Dr. Fairweather attempted to regain control of the situation. "Gentlemen, I assure you that our methods exceed all established standards. Every measurement has been verified multiple times. Our accuracy rates are unprecedented. Then you won't mind if we examine your source documentation, the Ministry observer pressed. Professor Blackwood has suggested there may be discrepancies in some of the coastal survey data. It was at this moment that Dr. Meridian stepped forward, her portfolio held like a shield before her. Dr. Fairweather, she said, her voice barely above a whisper but audible in the suddenly silent room, perhaps we should discuss the technical specifications privately before. Alice, please, Dr. Fairweather cut her off, his composure beginning to crack. This is neither the time nor the place for technical details. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. In her experience, when people desperately wanted to avoid discussing technical details, those details were usually the most important part of the story. She also noticed that young Timothy Ashford had begun to perspire, despite the cool morning air. Professor Blackwood was not to be deterred. Edmund, 3 separate sources have contacted me regarding irregularities in the tidal calculations for the Devon Coast surveys. The mathematical models appear to show readings that would require tidal variations physically impossible for that region. The Ministry observer leaned forward. Are you suggesting deliberate falsification of survey data? The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly drawing chimney. Miss Marple watched as the various players processed this bombshell. Miss Thornfield's expression had shifted from satisfaction to genuine concern. Mr. Wainwright was now consulting his ledger with obvious anxiety. David Pemberton, who had been standing near the maps, stepped closer as if to protect them. Gentlemen, Dr. Fairweather said, his voice now clearly strained, I categorically deny any falsification. Our methods are sound, our measurements accurate. If there are questions about specific calculations, I'm happy to address them through proper channels. The proper channel, the Ministry observer replied coldly, is right here, right now. Dr. Meridian, you mentioned technical specifications. Perhaps you could enlighten us. Dr. Meridian looked like a rabbit caught in a trap. Her eyes darted between Dr. Fairweather and the Ministry observer, her grip on the portfolio tightening until her knuckles were white. The technical aspects are quite complex. Perhaps if we could schedule a separate meeting. Dr. Meridian, Professor Blackwood said gently but firmly, the integrity of British cartography is at stake. If you have information relevant to these concerns, professional duty requires that you share it. Miss Marple observed the interplay with fascination. Dr. Meridian was clearly torn between loyalty to her superior and what appeared to be a growing crisis of conscience. In the village, Miss Marple had seen similar struggles many times, the moment when someone must choose between protecting a friend and protecting the truth. The decision was made for Dr. Meridian when Timothy Ashford suddenly stood up, his face flushed and his hands shaking. Dr. Fairweather, he said, his voice cracking with emotion, I can't let this continue. The Ministry needs to know about the pressure readings. About what you asked me to do with the calibration data. The room erupted in murmurs. Dr. Fairweather's face went through several shades of color before settling on a sickly gray. Timothy, you're overwrought. Perhaps you should step outside for some air. No, Timothy said, more firmly now. I won't be overwrought about falsifying government survey data. I won't be overwrought about putting shipping lanes at risk because the calculations don't match the political requirements. Miss Marple noticed that David Pemberton had moved closer to the door, as if considering an exit. Miss Thornfield was writing rapidly in a small notebook, documenting everything. Mr. Wainwright appeared to be having difficulty breathing. The Ministry observer stood up, his expression grave. Dr. Fairweather, I'm suspending this presentation pending a full investigation. No one is to leave these premises until we've had a chance to examine all relevant documentation. This is highly irregular, Dr. Fairweather protested. You can't simply. I can and I am, the observer replied. The accuracy of His Majesty's survey data is not a matter for negotiation. As the formal presentation dissolved into chaos, Miss Marple quietly gathered her knitting and moved toward a corner where she could observe the various reactions. Professor Blackwood was speaking in low, urgent tones with the Ministry observers. Dr. Meridian still clutched her portfolio but now seemed to be trying to make herself invisible. Timothy Ashford sat heavily in his chair, his face buried in his hands. Most interestingly, Miss Marple noticed that Dr. Fairweather, despite his obvious distress, kept glancing toward a particular filing cabinet near the front of the room. In her experience, when people under pressure repeatedly looked at specific locations, those locations usually contained something significant. The morning that had begun with such promise for British cartographic excellence had devolved into accusations of data falsification and professional misconduct. Miss Marple reflected that in her long experience with human nature, the most dangerous moments often came not when people were caught in wrongdoing, but when they realized they were about to be caught. As she watched Dr. Fairweather's increasingly desperate attempts to regain control of the situation, she couldn't shake the feeling that the day's troubles were far from over. In her experience, when cornered people began to panic, the consequences could be far more serious than anyone anticipated. The warning signs were all there, clear as the precise measurements on the maps that surrounded them. Miss Marple only hoped that someone else would recognize them before it was too late. Chapter 3: A Survey Cut Short. Miss Marple had always believed that when people gathered to discuss precision and accuracy, the universe had a way of introducing the most imprecise and inaccurate elements possible. By 10:30 that morning, the Ordnance Survey's annual symposium had thoroughly validated this observation. Following the suspension of Dr. Fairweather's presentation, the assembled group had scattered like startled birds. The ministry observers had commandeered Dr. Fairweather's office for their preliminary investigation, while the department staff found themselves in the awkward position of continuing their day's work under a cloud of official suspicion. Miss Marple had positioned herself in the library with her knitting, watching the comings and goings with her characteristic patience. She observed Dr. Fairweather pacing in the corridor outside his office, occasionally attempting to enter only to be politely but firmly turned away by the ministry officials. His earlier composure had completely evaporated, replaced by the desperate energy of a man watching his career crumble. At 11:15, Dr. Meridian approached Dr. Fairweather in the corridor, her portfolio still clutched protectively. Miss Marple, who had found that people often forgot about elderly ladies with knitting, was able to observe their hushed conversation from her position near the library door. "Edmund," Dr. Meridian said, her voice barely audible, "we need to discuss the calibration records. Before they ask for them specifically." "Alice, not here," Dr. Fairweather replied tersely. "My office, once these officials finish their preliminary review." "But Edmund, you don't understand. The records show." "I understand perfectly well what the records show," Dr. Fairweather cut her off. "I also understand what needs to be done about them." Miss Marple noticed the way Dr. Meridian's face went pale at these words. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned that the most chilling conversations were often the quietest ones. Shortly after noon, the ministry observers emerged from their preliminary examination with grave expressions. The senior official, a Mr. Hartwell, gathered the department staff in the main hall. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "our initial review has raised serious concerns about data integrity in your coastal survey project. We will be conducting a comprehensive audit of all related documentation. Dr. Fairweather, we'll need access to your personal files, calibration records, and correspondence related to this project." Dr. Fairweather's response was immediate and sharp. "Mr. Hartwell, I protest this treatment. My department has served the Crown with distinction for decades. These accusations are based on rumor and speculation." "The accusations," Mr. Hartwell replied coolly, "are based on mathematical impossibilities in your submitted data. Tidal variations that would require the laws of physics to be suspended. Survey triangulations that don't correspond to the actual geography. Dr. Fairweather, these aren't matters of opinion." Miss Marple observed the faces around the room during this exchange. Timothy Ashford seemed relieved that the truth was finally emerging. Miss Thornfield was taking careful notes. David Pemberton stood near the door, his weathered face unreadable. Mr. Wainwright appeared to be calculating something in his head, his lips moving silently. "I'll need access to your office immediately," Mr. Hartwell continued. "All files, all correspondence, all technical documentation." "Of course," Dr. Fairweather replied stiffly. "Though I maintain that this investigation will vindicate our methods completely. As the group began to disperse, Miss Marple noticed Dr. Fairweather exchange a meaningful glance with Dr. Meridian. It was the kind of look that passed between people who shared a dangerous secret, and in Miss Marple's experience, such looks were rarely harbingers of good fortune. The afternoon proceeded with the steady rhythm of an official investigation. Ministry observers moved through the building, examining files, interviewing staff, and gradually assembling a picture of systematic data manipulation. Miss Marple remained in the library, her knitting providing the perfect excuse to observe the increasing tension among the department staff. At 3 o'clock, Dr. Fairweather requested a private meeting with Mr. Hartwell. They closeted themselves in the conference room for nearly an hour, and when they emerged, both men looked grim. Miss Marple noticed that Dr. Fairweather's hands were shaking as he lit his pipe. "Dr. Meridian," Mr. Hartwell called out, "we'll need to speak with you next. Please bring any technical documentation related to the calibration procedures." Dr. Meridian's face went ashen. She clutched her portfolio more tightly and glanced toward Dr. Fairweather, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod. "Certainly, Mr. Hartwell. I'll just need a few minutes to gather the relevant materials." Miss Marple watched as Dr. Meridian hurried toward the technical archives, her portfolio still in hand. Something about her urgency struck Miss Marple as significant. In her experience, people who needed a few minutes to gather materials were often gathering something quite different than what they claimed. It was at 4:30 that Raymond found his great-aunt in the library, her knitting needles clicking with unusual intensity. "Aunt Jane, this has been quite a day. I'm afraid the symposium hasn't been what we expected." "No, dear," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "Though perhaps it's been exactly what some people expected. Tell me, Raymond, has Dr. Fairweather seemed troubled lately? Before today, I mean." Raymond considered this. "Well, now that you mention it, he has been working very late hours. And there have been several heated discussions with Dr. Meridian about technical specifications." "Why do you ask?" Before Miss Marple could respond, a commotion erupted from the technical archives. Raised voices, the sound of filing cabinets slamming, and then Dr. Meridian's voice, high with distress. "It's gone. The entire calibration file, it's been removed." Miss Marple and Raymond hurried toward the sound, along with several other staff members. They found Dr. Meridian standing in front of an open filing cabinet, her face white with shock. "What's missing, Alice?" Miss Thornfield asked, arriving with Timothy Ashford close behind. "The master calibration records for the coastal survey. The entire file, months of technical documentation. Someone has taken it." Mr. Hartwell appeared, his expression severe. "Dr. Meridian, those records were specifically requested for our investigation. Are you saying they've been deliberately removed?" I don't know. They were here this morning. I checked them myself when the investigation began." Miss Marple observed the scene with growing concern. In her experience, when crucial evidence disappeared during official investigations, the situation had moved well beyond simple professional misconduct. "Who has access to these files?" Mr. Hartwell demanded. "All the senior staff," Dr. Meridian replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Fairweather, myself, Miss Thornfield, Mr. Wainwright, Mr. Pemberton." "And where is Dr. Fairweather now?" The question hung in the air as everyone looked around. Dr. Fairweather, who had been nervously pacing the corridors all day, was nowhere to be seen. "His office," Timothy suggested. "He said he needed to review some personal files." The group moved toward Dr. Fairweather's office, but they found it empty. His desk was neat, his papers organized, his pipe still smoldering in the ashtray. But Dr. Fairweather himself was absent. "Check the building," Mr. Hartwell ordered. "He can't have gone far." It was David Pemberton who found him 20 minutes later, calling out from the basement archive room in a voice that sent chills through everyone who heard it. "Down here. Quickly. Something's happened to Dr. Fairweather." Miss Marple descended the narrow stairs with the others, her heart heavy with the certainty that the day's troubles had taken their darkest turn. The basement archive was a maze of filing cabinets and document storage, lit by harsh electric bulbs that cast sharp shadows in every corner. They found Dr. Fairweather collapsed beside an overturned filing cabinet, papers scattered around him like fallen leaves. Mr. Pemberton knelt beside him, his face grave. "I'm afraid he's gone," Pemberton said quietly. "Looks like the filing cabinet fell on him. Heavy thing, could easily have crushed him if he was trying to reach something on top." But Miss Marple, approaching the scene with her characteristic careful observation, noticed several details that didn't quite fit this explanation. Dr. Fairweather's pipe was missing, unusual for a man who rarely went anywhere without it. His jacket was buttoned differently than it had been upstairs. Most significantly, his position relative to the fallen cabinet suggested he had been moving away from it, not toward it, when it fell. "An accident," Mr. Hartwell murmured, his official mind already processing the implications. "Though given the circumstances of our investigation." "A very convenient accident," Miss Thornfield observed grimly. Miss Marple continued her quiet examination of the scene while the others debated whether to call the police or simply treat this as a tragic mishap. In her long experience with sudden deaths, she had learned that the most important clues were often the smallest ones, easily overlooked in the immediate shock of discovery. And there, barely visible beneath the scattered papers, she spotted something that made her breath catch, a small piece of calibration equipment, its brass surface scratched and bent, as if it had been used for something far different than measuring angles and distances. The tool of precision had become an instrument of violence, and Miss Marple realized that the Ordnance Survey's crisis had moved far beyond questions of professional misconduct. Someone in this building was willing to kill to protect their secrets, and until those secrets were uncovered, no one was safe. As the authorities were summoned and the basement archive became a crime scene, Miss Marple reflected that the most accurate survey of all would be the one that mapped the human motivations behind this tragedy. And that was a survey she was uniquely qualified to conduct. Chapter 4: The Compass Points to Murder. Inspector Wallace of the Hampshire Constabulary arrived at Ordnance House within the hour, accompanied by Sergeant Mills and the local police surgeon. Miss Marple had encountered Inspector Wallace several times during her various encounters with criminal activity, and she was pleased to see that he still possessed the methodical approach that had served him well in previous investigations. Right then, Inspector Wallace announced to the assembled group in the main hall, "Dr. Fairweather's death is being treated as suspicious pending further investigation. No one is to leave the premises until we've had a chance to speak with each of you individually." Miss Marple settled herself in her customary corner with her knitting, observing the various reactions to this announcement. The ministry observers looked distinctly uncomfortable at finding themselves witnesses in a potential murder investigation. The department staff displayed a range of emotions from shock to what appeared to be relief. Dr. Meridian sat rigidly upright, her precious portfolio still clutched in her hands. Miss Marple noticed that her knuckles had gone white from gripping it so tightly, and she wondered what secrets those technical documents might contain. Inspector Wallace began his preliminary interviews in Dr. Fairweather's office, calling first for Mr. Hartwell to establish the official timeline of events. Miss Marple, whose hearing remained quite sharp despite her years, positioned herself strategically near the office door. The deceased was facing serious allegations regarding data falsification, Mr. Hartwell explained. Our investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic manipulation of survey results. Dr. Fairweather was becoming increasingly agitated as our examination proceeded. Did he make any statement suggesting he might harm himself? Inspector Wallace inquired. Nothing explicit. But he was clearly under tremendous pressure. His career, his reputation, everything was at stake. Miss Marple frowned at this line of reasoning. In her experience, men like Dr. Fairweather, with their pride and professional standing, were more likely to fight accusations than to flee from them through self-destruction. The suicide theory struck her as convenient but unconvincing. Timothy Ashford was interviewed next, and his testimony proved more illuminating. Dr. Fairweather had been acting strangely for weeks, Timothy admitted. He kept asking me to recalibrate measurements that had already been verified. When I questioned the necessity, he became quite sharp with me. What kind of measurements? Inspector Wallace asked. Tidal calculations primarily. and some of the triangulation data for the Devon coast. He seemed particularly concerned about those specific surveys. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. Tidal calculations and coastal triangulation, precisely the areas where Professor Blackwood had identified mathematical impossibilities. The pattern was becoming clearer. Dr. Meridian's interview was the most tense. She entered the office clutching her portfolio and emerged 40 minutes later looking thoroughly shaken. Miss Marple observed that she immediately sought out Miss Thornfield, engaging her in hushed conversation near the technical displays. "Margaret," Dr. Meridian whispered urgently, "they're asking about the calibration standards. About who had access to the master records." "Alice, you need to tell them the truth," Miss Thornfield replied firmly. "Whatever Edmund was involved in, it's over now. The important thing is to protect the integrity of the department." Miss Marple found this exchange particularly interesting. Miss Thornfield's concern for departmental integrity suggested she had been aware of irregularities but had perhaps chosen not to act on them. In Miss Marple's experience, such delayed conscience often indicated complex loyalties and difficult choices. When Inspector Wallace called for David Pemberton, the weathered field supervisor appeared notably nervous. His interview lasted over an hour, and when he emerged, he immediately stepped outside for air, his face pale despite his outdoor tan. "David," Miss Marple approached him on the terrace where he stood smoking, "this must be very difficult for you. Finding Dr. Fairweather like that." Pemberton looked at her with surprise, as if he'd forgotten about the elderly lady with the knitting. "Yes, it was shocking. Edmund was a good man, fundamentally. Whatever mistakes he made, he didn't deserve to die alone in that basement. You were colleagues for many years. Nearly 15. I've seen him build this department from nothing into something truly impressive. The pressure from the ministry, the accusations, it must have been unbearable." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, but she noticed that Pemberton's hands were shaking as he lit another cigarette. In her experience, men who spent their lives outdoors in challenging conditions rarely showed such obvious signs of distress unless they had witnessed something particularly disturbing. "Tell me," she continued gently, "when you found him in the basement, did anything strike you as unusual?" Pemberton's eye sharpened. "What do you mean?" "Oh, nothing specific. It's just that in my limited experience with such matters, one notices small details. His positioning, perhaps, or the way the filing cabinet had fallen." For a moment, Pemberton seemed about to say something significant. Then his expression closed off. "I'm sure the police will determine what happened. I'm just a field man, I measure landscapes, not crime scenes." Miss Marple accepted this deflection gracefully, but she filed away his momentary hesitation for future consideration. Mr. Wainwright's interview proved equally revealing, though in an unexpected direction. The department treasurer emerged from the office looking relieved rather than distressed, and Miss Marple observed him consulting his ledger with what appeared to be satisfaction. "Charles," Miss Thornfield approached him, "how are you managing with all this scrutiny?" "Better than expected, actually," Wainwright replied, adjusting his spectacles. "The ministry observers seem satisfied with our financial records. Whatever Edmund's troubles were, they weren't monetary." Miss Marple found this comment intriguing. If Dr. Fairweather's difficulties weren't financial, what had motivated the data falsification? In her experience, when people risked their careers and reputations, the stakes were usually either money or something even more valuable to them personally. Professor Blackwood's interview was conducted with particular deference, given his emeritus status and his role in exposing the irregularities. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe his entrance and exit, noting that he carried himself with the bearing of someone whose conscience was clear. "A tragic end to a promising career," Professor Blackwood remarked to the assembled group after his interview. Whatever Edmund's mistakes, he was a brilliant cartographer. The pressure of discovery must have been overwhelming. Miss Marple noticed, however, that several staff members exchanged glances at this comment. Timothy Ashford in particular seemed to have something he wanted to say but didn't dare. When Inspector Wallace finally called for Miss Marple herself, she was prepared with her own observations. "I understand you're here as a guest," Miss Marple, Inspector Wallace began, but given your previous experiences with such matters, I'd value your impressions of today's events. How kind of you to ask, Inspector. I must say, the dynamics among the staff are quite fascinating. Rather like our church committees, but with higher stakes. Any particular observations? Miss Marple considered carefully. Well, it struck me as curious that Dr. Fairweather's pipe was missing when we found him. He'd been smoking it in his office just before he disappeared. And his jacket, the buttons were fastened differently than they had been upstairs. Inspector Wallace made notes. Anything else? The filing cabinet that presumably fell on him, it's quite heavy, as Mr. Pemberton noted. But Dr. Fairweather was positioned as if he'd been moving away from it, not reaching toward it. Almost as if he'd been struck by something else and then the cabinet was arranged afterward. That's a serious accusation, Miss Marple. Oh, I'm not accusing anyone, Inspector. Simply observing that the scene raised questions in my mind. There was also a small calibration instrument beneath the papers. It appeared to have been damaged in some way. Inspector Wallace made additional notes. We'll examine that instrument carefully. Anything about the staff that struck you as significant? Dr. Meridian seems terribly concerned about her portfolio. She's guarded it like a state secret all day. And young Mr. Ashford appears to know more about the irregularities than he's admitted. He has the look of someone carrying a burden of guilty knowledge. Thank you, Miss Marple. Your observations are always illuminating. As the interviews concluded, Inspector Wallace gathered the group for a preliminary statement. Dr. Fairweather's death appears to have resulted from injuries sustained when a filing cabinet fell on him in the basement archive. However, given the circumstances of the ongoing investigation and certain irregularities at the scene, we're treating this as a suspicious death pending further examination. Miss Marple watched the faces around the room carefully. Dr. Meridian looked terrified. Miss Thornfield appeared grimly determined. Mr. Wainwright seemed almost satisfied. David Pemberton stared at the floor. Timothy Ashford fidgeted with obvious anxiety. The building will remain under police supervision overnight, Inspector Wallace continued. We'll be conducting a thorough examination of the basement archive and Dr. Fairweather's office. I'll need each of you to remain available for further questioning. As the group began to disperse, Miss Marple approached Inspector Wallace privately. Inspector, might I suggest examining Dr. Fairweather's recent correspondence? And perhaps that missing calibration file that Dr. Meridian mentioned? In my experience, when important documents disappear during investigations, they often hold the key to understanding the entire situation. Already noted, Miss Marple. We'll be conducting a thorough search tonight. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. I do hope you'll examine that damaged calibration instrument as well. In precision work like cartography, the tools themselves can tell quite a story. As evening settled over Ordnance House, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. The official investigation had established a timeline and gathered preliminary evidence, but the human motivations remained murky. Someone in that building had secrets worth killing for, and until those secrets were exposed, the truth about Dr. Fairweather's death would remain as elusive as an unmapped territory. The measuring of evidence had begun, but Miss Marple suspected that the most important measurements would be those of human character, ambition, and desperation. And in her long experience, those were often the most difficult calculations of all. Chapter 5, Triangulating the Past. The next morning brought a grey October drizzle that seemed to match the somber mood at Ordnance House. Miss Marple arrived early, as was her custom, and found Inspector Wallace already at work with his team, systematically examining every corner of the building. The basement archive had been sealed overnight, and Dr. Fairweather's office remained under police supervision. Connor observed that Miss Marple had spent much of the previous evening reflecting on the day's events, and her intuition told her that the key to understanding Dr. Fairweather's death lay not in the immediate circumstances, but in the relationships and secrets that had been building over months or perhaps years. Inspector Wallace approached her as she settled into the library with her knitting. Miss Marple, we've made some interesting discoveries during our overnight examination. That calibration instrument you mentioned, it shows signs of having been used as a weapon. Blood traces consistent with head trauma. I see, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. And the missing calibration files? Still missing. But we did find something intriguing in Dr. Fairweather's personal desk. Inspector Wallace held up a folder. Correspondence dating back 18 months, suggesting he'd been under pressure from multiple sources. Miss Marple's needles clicked with interest. What sort of pressure? Financial pressure from the ministry regarding budget overruns. Professional pressure from Professor Blackwood regarding accuracy standards. And personal pressure from someone signing themselves at M, demanding meetings and threatening to expose what they called systematic deception. M could be any number of people, Miss Marple observed. Dr. Meridian, Miss Thornfield's first name is Margaret, Mr. Wainwright's middle name might begin with M. Precisely. We'll be conducting more detailed interviews today, focusing on these historical relationships. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. In her experience, murders rarely sprang from immediate circumstances alone. They were usually the culmination of long-simmering tensions, gradually building pressure, and finally, a moment when that pressure exceeded someone's ability to contain it. Inspector Wallace called Dr. Meridian for the first detailed interview. This time, Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe not just the office door, but also the reactions of the other staff members to Dr. Meridian's prolonged absence. Miss Thornfield paced nervously near the technical displays, occasionally glancing toward the office. Timothy Ashford sat hunched over his work, but Miss Marple noticed he wasn't actually accomplishing anything. His papers remained unmarked despite his apparent concentration. Most intriguingly, Mr. Wainwright kept consulting his pocket watch, as if timing Dr. Meridian's interview. When Dr. Meridian finally emerged after nearly 2 hours, her face was streaked with tears and her precious portfolio was no longer in her possession. She immediately sought out Miss Thornfield, and their whispered conversation was intense and urgent. "Margaret, they know about the calibration standards," Dr. Meridian said, her voice barely audible but carrying in the quiet building. "They found the correspondence about the pressure readings." "Alice, you should have told the truth from the beginning," Miss Thornfield replied firmly. "Now it looks like you were covering something up." "I was protecting Edmund. And the department. If the true extent of the irregularities had been exposed." Miss Marple's attention sharpened at this exchange. The true extent suggested that the data falsification had been more comprehensive than initially revealed. Miss Thornfield was called next, and her interview lasted even longer than Dr. Meridian's. When she emerged, her usual composed demeanor had cracked, and she appeared genuinely shaken. Timothy Ashford intercepted her near the entrance hall. "Margaret, what did they ask you?" "About the triangulation data." "Everything, Timothy. They know about the systematic adjustments, the pressure from the ministry for faster results, the shortcuts Edmund approved." Miss Thornfield paused, studying the young man's face. "They also know about your role in the recalibrations." Timothy's face went pale. "My role? I only did what Dr. Fairweather instructed. When he asked me to adjust the readings to match the political requirements." "That's exactly what you need to tell them, Timothy. The truth, the whole truth, regardless of how it reflects on Edmund's memory." Miss Marple found this conversation particularly revealing. The political requirements suggested that the data falsification hadn't been motivated by personal gain, but rather by pressure to produce results that matched external expectations. In her experience, such institutional pressure often created the most complex moral dilemmas. Professor Blackwood's second interview was conducted with particular gravity. As the man who had initially exposed the irregularities, his perspective was crucial to understanding the scope of the deception. When he emerged, he sought out Miss Marple directly. "Miss Marple, Inspector Wallace mentioned that you've had experience with such matters. I wonder if I might share some concerns with you." "Of course, Professor Blackwood. Please, sit down." The elderly academic settled into a chair beside her, his distinguished bearing somewhat diminished by obvious distress. "I fear I may have precipitated this tragedy," he began. "When I received reports about the mathematical impossibilities in Edmund's data, I felt duty-bound to investigate. But I never imagined it would lead to his death." You were following your professional conscience, Miss Marple replied gently. One cannot be held responsible for the desperate actions of others. But you see, the situation was more complex than I initially realized. The pressure on Edmund wasn't entirely of his own making. There were demands from the ministry for accelerated results, budget constraints that made proper verification difficult, and political considerations that I'm only now beginning to understand. Miss Marple's needles paused. What sort of political considerations? The coastal survey data was needed for strategic planning, military installations, shipping lanes, potential vulnerability assessments. Edmund was caught between scientific accuracy and national security requirements that demanded immediate results. This revelation cast Dr. Fairweather's actions in a new light. Rather than simple professional misconduct, he had been trapped between conflicting loyalties to scientific truth and to serving national interests under pressure. Professor, did Dr. Fairweather ever discuss these pressures with you directly? Not initially. But in recent weeks, he had begun reaching out. He scheduled several meetings that he then cancelled at the last minute. I believe he was struggling with his conscience. Miss Marple considered this carefully. And the others, Dr. Meridian, Miss Thornfield, the younger staff, were they aware of these political pressures? Some more than others. Alice Meridian was deeply involved in the technical aspects. She would have known the extent of the adjustments. Margaret Thornfield, as senior cartographer, would have seen the patterns. The younger staff like Timothy Ashford were probably following orders without fully understanding the implications. The picture was becoming clearer, but it also raised new questions. If Dr. Fairweather had been planning to confess his dilemma to Professor Blackwood, why had he died before doing so? And who among his colleagues had felt threatened enough by such a confession to take desperate action? David Pemberton's second interview provided another piece of the puzzle. When he emerged, he looked grim and headed directly for the telephone in the main hall. Yes, I need to speak to Ministry Defense Liaison, he said into the receiver, his voice carrying clearly. This is David Pemberton, Ordnance Survey Field Operations. We have a situation that affects coastal defense planning. Yes, I'll hold. Miss Marple exchanged glances with Professor Blackwood. Defense Liaison, the military connection was becoming explicit. When Mr. Wainwright was called for his second interview, he carried his ledger and what appeared to be additional financial records. His session lasted shorter than the others, and when he emerged, he looked almost relieved. Charles, Miss Thornfield approached him. Are the financial aspects resolved? More or less, Wainwright replied, adjusting his spectacles. The ministry is satisfied that no funds were misappropriated. Edmund's problems were professional, not monetary. Miss Marple found this curious. If money hadn't been the motivation, and if Dr. Fairweather had been acting under institutional pressure rather than personal greed, then what had driven someone to murder him? The answer, she suspected, lay in the complex web of professional relationships, personal loyalties, and institutional pressures that had been gradually revealed through the day's interviews. Someone in that building had secrets that went beyond data falsification, secrets worth killing to protect. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern. Dr. Fairweather had been caught between competing loyalties, gradually crushed by pressures from multiple sources. His colleagues had been complicit to varying degrees, some knowingly, others perhaps innocently following orders. But murder required more than complicity or even guilt. It required someone who felt personally threatened by exposure, someone whose own position, reputation, or secrets would be destroyed if Dr. Fairweather's full confession came to light. The triangulation of past relationships was revealing the true geography of motive, and Miss Marple suspected that the most dangerous territory was still unmapped. Chapter 6: Instruments of Precision. The following morning brought Inspector Wallace's forensic team, armed with the latest scientific equipment for examining the crime scene. Miss Marple watched with keen interest as they methodically photographed and measured every aspect of the basement archive where Dr. Fairweather had died. Connor had often observed that Miss Marple possessed an almost uncanny ability to spot significance in the smallest details, and today that talent was particularly valuable as the physical evidence began to tell its story. Dr. Henderson, the police surgeon, approached Inspector Wallace with his preliminary findings as Miss Marple happened to be passing through the corridor. The head trauma is consistent with being struck by that calibration instrument you found, Dr. Henderson reported. But there's something peculiar about the pattern of injuries. The fatal blow came from above and behind, not the angle you'd expect if someone were reaching for something and had a filing cabinet fall on them. Inspector Wallace nodded grimly. So we're definitely looking at murder, then? I'm afraid so. And there's something else, fibers under the victim's fingernails that don't match his own clothing. Dark wool, good quality. Suggests he grabbed his attacker during the struggle. Miss Marple made a mental note of this detail. Dark wool of good quality described several of the staff members' clothing, but she had particularly noticed Miss Thornfield's charcoal wool jacket and Mr. Pemberton's navy pullover. The forensic examination of Dr. Fairweather's office yielded additional insights. The team discovered a hidden compartment in his desk containing additional correspondence and what appeared to be draft letters that had never been sent. Inspector Wallace shared these findings with Miss Marple privately, knowing her insights had proven valuable in previous cases. The hidden correspondence confirms Professor Blackwood's assessment, Inspector Wallace explained. Dr. Fairweather was under tremendous pressure from multiple sources. But these draft letters suggest he was planning to expose not just his own actions, but someone else's as well. What sort of exposure? Miss Marple asked, her knitting needles clicking thoughtfully. Listen to this, it's from a draft letter dated just 3 days ago. The systematic falsification of survey data was not my initiative alone. The pressure to produce acceptable results came from sources both within and outside the department. If I am to face consequences, I cannot in good conscience allow others to escape accountability for their roles in this deception. Miss Marple's expression grew grave. He was planning to implicate others. More than that. There's another draft that's even more specific. The calibration standards were deliberately altered to produce desired results rather than accurate measurements. This was done at the explicit request of. And then the draft breaks off. At the explicit request of whom, one wonders, Miss Marple murmured. Someone senior enough to give such instructions, presumably. The forensic team's examination of the basement archive provided the most revealing evidence. The scattered papers around Dr. Fairweather's body told a story of desperate searching, but also careful arrangement after the fact. Sergeant Mills reported his findings to Inspector Wallace within Miss Marple's hearing. The papers were definitely disturbed twice, sir. Once during what appears to have been a genuine search, and then again afterward, probably to create the appearance of accidental death. Several documents are missing from the files, but we found traces of them in the victim's jacket pocket. What sort of documents? Technical specifications and calibration records. The kind of papers that would prove systematic falsification rather than isolated errors. Miss Marple found this particularly significant. Someone had killed Dr. Fairweather for those specific documents, then arranged the scene to appear accidental. The missing papers were likely the same ones Dr. Meridian had reported as stolen from the filing cabinet upstairs. Inspector Wallace called another round of interviews, this time focusing on the specific technical knowledge required to understand the significance of the missing documents. Dr. Meridian's third interview was the most intense yet. When she emerged, she was openly weeping and immediately approached Miss Marple. Miss Marple, might I speak with you? I feel so terribly alone in all this. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and gave Dr. Meridian her full attention. In her experience, when people were ready to unburden themselves of secrets, it was important to listen carefully. My dear, of course. What's troubling you? It's about the calibration standards, Dr. Meridian began, her voice barely above a whisper. Inspector Wallace has been asking about who had the technical knowledge to alter them systematically. The truth is, it would require someone with very specialized expertise. And you possess such expertise? Yes, but so do others. Margaret Thornfield certainly has the technical background. Even Timothy Ashford has been learning these procedures. But Inspector Wallace keeps asking about something else, about who would benefit from covering up the alterations. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. And what did you tell him? The truth, finally. that Edmund wasn't the only one under pressure. We all were. The ministry demanded results faster than proper verification allowed. When Edmund started making systematic adjustments to meet their deadlines, some of us helped him. You assisted with the falsification? Dr. Meridian nodded miserably. We thought we were serving the greater good. The data was close to accurate, just adjusted to fall within acceptable parameters. We never imagined it would lead to murder. Miss Marple considered this carefully. Dr. Meridian, did Dr. Fairweather know about your involvement? Oh yes. He protected us all by taking full responsibility. But those draft letters Inspector Wallace found, Edmund was going to reveal everything. All of our roles, all of our compromises. This revelation cast the murder in a new light. Someone had killed Dr. Fairweather not just to stop his confession, but to prevent the exposure of their own complicity. Miss Thornfield's interview yielded similar revelations. When she emerged, she sought out Timothy Ashford for an urgent private conversation. Timothy, they know about our involvement in the adjustments. The inspector has evidence that multiple people participated in the falsification. Timothy's face went ashen. Margaret, I only did what I was told. I never understood the full implications. That's exactly what you must tell them. But Timothy, there's something else. Inspector Wallace asked specifically about who would have known about Edmund's plans to confess everything. About who had access to his private correspondence. Miss Marple observed this exchange with growing understanding. The circle of complicity was wider than initially apparent, and the stakes for exposure were correspondingly higher. Professor Blackwood's insights proved crucial to understanding the technical aspects of the case. The level of systematic alteration required deep knowledge of cartographic principles, he explained to Inspector Wallace in Miss Marple's presence. This wasn't simply changing a few numbers. It required understanding the complex relationships between tidal patterns, geological surveys, and triangulation calculations. How many people in the department would possess such knowledge? Inspector Wallace asked. At the senior level? Dr. Fairweather certainly, Dr. Meridian absolutely, Miss Thornfield without question. Mr. Pemberton would understand the field aspects, though perhaps not the mathematical complexities. Even young Ashford has been learning these advanced techniques. And the motivation for murder. Professor Blackwood considered this gravely. Professional ruin, certainly. But there might be more serious consequences. If this systematic falsification had continued, it could have compromised national security. Ships could have run aground, military installations could have been misplaced, coastal defenses could have been rendered ineffective. Miss Marple found this assessment sobering. The stakes had been higher than simple professional misconduct, they had involved national security, making the pressure to cover up the deception correspondingly intense. As the day's interviews concluded, the physical evidence had revealed the method and means of Dr. Fairweather's murder. Someone with technical expertise had killed him to obtain specific documents and prevent his planned confession. The scene had been carefully arranged to appear accidental, but forensic science had exposed the deception. The question now was which of the technically qualified suspects had felt threatened enough by Dr. Fairweather's planned revelations to resort to murder. Miss Marple suspected that the answer lay not just in technical capability, but in the complex web of personal and professional relationships that had made the falsification possible in the first place. The instruments of precision had revealed their secrets, but the most important measurement remained to be taken, the calculation of human desperation and moral compromise that had led to murder. Chapter 7: Charting Dangerous Waters. Inspector Wallace had spent the morning reviewing the forensic evidence with his team, and by afternoon he was ready to expand the investigation beyond the immediate circle of department staff. Miss Marple observed this development with satisfaction, knowing from experience that the most important clues often lay outside the obvious scope of investigation. Connor noted that Miss Marple had been particularly thoughtful during her morning knitting, her needles clicking in the rhythm that indicated deep contemplation. She had been reviewing all the conversations she had observed, searching for the threads that connected the various players in this tragedy. The first expansion came when Inspector Wallace contacted the Ministry's Defense Liaison Office, following up on David Pemberton's telephone call from the previous day. Commander Morrison arrived from London within hours, a stern military man whose presence immediately changed the atmosphere at Ordnance House. His meeting with Inspector Wallace lasted over an hour, and when they emerged, both men looked grave. "Miss Marple," Inspector Wallace approached her in the library, "Commander Morrison has provided some crucial background information. It seems the coastal survey data was needed for more than routine mapping. Oh. Strategic defense planning. The Royal Navy was depending on this survey data for positioning new installations and updating shipping lanes. If the data was systematically falsified, it could have compromised national security." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the pressure for rapid completion. International tensions have been escalating. The Navy needed the updated maps for defensive preparations. Dr. Fairweather was caught between impossible demands: produce accurate results immediately. This revelation cast the entire situation in starker relief. Dr. Fairweather hadn't simply been dealing with professional pressure, but with matters of national importance that made failure unthinkable. Commander Morrison interviewed each of the senior staff members privately, and Miss Marple observed their reactions to military scrutiny. Dr. Meridian appeared terrified by the security implications. Miss Thornfield maintained her professional composure but seemed shaken by the broader consequences. David Pemberton, surprisingly, seemed relieved to finally discuss the military aspects openly. The field survey data was solid, she overheard Pemberton telling Commander Morrison. Whatever adjustments were made happened in the office, during the mathematical processing. My teams provided accurate raw measurements. This distinction proved significant. The falsification had occurred during data analysis, not during field collection, which narrowed the range of people with opportunity to those handling the computational aspects. Timothy Ashford's reaction to military scrutiny was particularly revealing. When Commander Morrison interviewed him, the young man emerged visibly shaken and immediately sought out Miss Marple. "Miss Marple, might I speak with you? I'm afraid I've been terribly naive about the implications of what we were doing." Miss Marple set aside her knitting and gave him her full attention. "What did you learn from Commander Morrison?" "The survey data we were adjusting, it wasn't just for routine mapping. It was for naval defense planning. The coordinates I was asked to alter could have affected the placement of submarine detection equipment, coastal batteries, shipping lane recommendations." "And Dr. Fairweather asked you to make these alterations?" Timothy nodded miserably. "He said the measurements needed to fall within acceptable parameters for ministry approval. I thought it was just bureaucratic requirements. I never realized we were potentially compromising national defense." Miss Marple studied the young man's distressed expression. "Timothy, did Dr. Fairweather seem concerned about these broader implications?" "In recent weeks, yes. He kept asking me to double-check certain calculations, particularly the tidal data for the submarine approaches. He seemed increasingly worried about something, but he wouldn't discuss it directly." This painted a picture of Dr. Fairweather gradually realizing the full consequences of his compromises, which aligned with his apparent decision to confess everything. The investigation expanded further when Inspector Wallace contacted Dr. Fairweather's private physician, Dr. Richards, who had treated him for stress-related ailments over the past several months. Dr. Richards' testimony, given privately to Inspector Wallace, provided additional insight into Dr. Fairweather's state of mind. He had been suffering from severe anxiety, insomnia, and what appeared to be symptoms of a guilty conscience. Miss Marple overheard Dr. Richards reporting. "In our last consultation, just a week ago, he spoke about putting things right and accepting the consequences of poor judgment. Did he mention any specific concerns about his safety?" Inspector Wallace asked. "Not directly. But he did ask about obtaining sleeping medication that would be reliable. At the time, I was concerned about suicidal thoughts, but in light of his murder, I wonder if he feared for his physical safety." This revelation suggested that Dr. Fairweather had been aware of danger, which made his presence in the basement archive on the day of his death seem less coincidental. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a conversation between Professor Blackwood and Commander Morrison near the technical displays. The systematic nature of the alteration suggests coordination among multiple staff members, Professor Blackwood was explaining. This wasn't the work of one person acting alone. And the implications for security clearances? Commander Morrison asked. Severe. Anyone involved in systematic falsification of defense-related data would face serious consequences, criminal charges, certainly, and possible treason considerations given the national security implications. Miss Marple reflected on this exchange. Treason charges would mean not just professional ruin, but potential imprisonment or worse. The stakes had been higher than anyone initially realized, which correspondingly increased the motivation for murder. The expanded investigation revealed another crucial element when Inspector Wallace examined Dr. Fairweather's bank records and personal correspondence more thoroughly. He had been consulting with a solicitor about whistleblower protections, Inspector Wallace reported to Miss Marple. Apparently, he was trying to find a way to expose the systematic falsification without facing treason charges himself. And did he find such protection? His solicitor advised him that cooperation with authorities and full disclosure would be his best defense. Dr. Fairweather had scheduled a meeting with ministry investigators for the day after he died. This timeline was crucial. Someone had known about Dr. Fairweather's planned confession and had acted to prevent it. The investigation's expansion also uncovered financial pressures beyond the department itself. The ministry had been facing budget cuts that made the rapid completion of the survey project essential for continued funding. Mr. Wainwright's role became clearer when his full financial records were examined. The department was facing significant budget reductions if the coastal survey wasn't completed on schedule, Inspector Wallace explained. Wainwright had been managing increasingly desperate financial circumstances, trying to stretch resources to meet impossible deadlines. Miss Marple found this revealing. Financial desperation could motivate people to compromise their principles, and the threat of budget cuts would have affected everyone's job security. As the expanded investigation proceeded, the web of pressures, compromises, and complicity became increasingly complex. Multiple people had been involved in the systematic falsification, driven by a combination of national security demands, financial constraints, and professional pressure. But murder required more than complicity or even guilt. It required someone who faced immediate, personal destruction if Dr. Fairweather's confession proceeded as planned. Miss Marple spent the evening reviewing all the evidence and observations, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she considered the expanding scope of the investigation. The survey had indeed grown larger, encompassing not just professional misconduct but matters of national security, financial desperation, and personal survival. Tomorrow would bring the need to focus this expanded understanding on identifying which of the several complicit parties had been desperate enough to resort to murder. The broader survey had mapped the territory of motive and opportunity, but the final triangulation would require identifying the specific point where desperation had turned to deadly action. Chapter 8: Documents That Kill. The fourth day brought a breakthrough when Inspector Wallace discovered the missing calibration files in a safety deposit box registered under Dr. Fairweather's name. The documents revealed systematic data alteration spanning 2 years, involving multiple staff members following ministry demands for faster results. Miss Marple examined correspondence between Dr. Fairweather and someone signing as a MT. The letters showed growing concern about military implications. Edmund, the submarine approach data cannot be adjusted further without compromising defensive capabilities. Perhaps it's time to consider full disclosure. The investigation took a dramatic turn when forensic analysis revealed 3 different typewriters had been used for falsified documents, including one registered to David Pemberton's home address. Most significantly, they discovered evidence of consulting fees paid to an outside expert for data optimization services, payments totaling thousands of pounds over 18 months, made to an account registered under Professor Blackwood's consulting office. When confronted, Professor Blackwood's composure cracked completely. "The ministry approached me 2 years ago," he confessed to Miss Marple. "I developed mathematical models allowing systematic adjustments within acceptable ranges. But gradually, the tolerances became broader. What began as minor adjustments became wholesale falsification. Professor Blackwood had stopped participating 6 weeks earlier, returning his final payment with a note about ethical concerns. His exposure of the irregularities had been an attempt to end the scheme he'd helped create. The crucial revelation came from Dr. Fairweather's personal diary, discovered in his home safe. An entry 3 days before his death read, "The pressure from M has become unbearable. The threats are no longer subtle. If I proceed with my planned confession, M has made it clear that I will face consequences beyond professional ruin." Miss Marple realized this them making threats was different from the MT encouraging confession. Someone had been threatening Dr. Fairweather to prevent his planned revelation, someone whose own position would be destroyed by complete honesty. The paper trail revealed both the technical architecture of the falsification and a personal motive for murder, but the most dangerous document was the one revealing who had the most to lose. Chapter 9: The Saboteur's Precise Plan. Inspector Wallace's forensic team made the breakthrough that would explain Dr. Fairweather's murder. The calibration instrument used as the weapon had been deliberately modified, precision weights replaced with lead shot to increase its mass. This wasn't spontaneous violence, it was premeditated murder disguised as an accident. The modification required specialized knowledge, Dr. Henderson reported. Someone with intimate understanding of precision instruments prepared this weapon well in advance. Miss Marple observed that the combination of technical expertise, familiarity with investigative procedures, and detailed building knowledge narrowed the suspects considerably. The forensic team's examination of typewriters revealed the crucial clue: the third machine, which didn't match any in the building, had a distinctive flaw in the letter M, and examples of this same flaw appeared in David Pemberton's office files. "The typewriter is registered to Pemberton's home address," Inspector Wallace announced. His role extends far beyond simple field operations. Miss Marple shared her observations about Pemberton's extensive knowledge of submarine approaches and coastal defense, expertise that exceeded his claimed position as a basic field supervisor. When they went to interview Pemberton, he had vanished, claiming urgent field work at the coastal survey sites. Commander Morrison provided the missing context: Pemberton served in the Royal Engineers. He has extensive training in demolitions and coastal defense planning. The forensic search of Pemberton's office revealed detailed notes about tidal patterns, submarine routes, and coastal vulnerabilities, suggesting systematic study of how to compromise naval defenses. Most damning, they discovered evidence of substantial payments from a consulting firm with foreign maritime connections, payments that corresponded exactly with the timeline of the most dangerous falsifications. He wasn't just compromising data under pressure, Inspector Wallace concluded. He was systematically providing information that would benefit foreign naval operations while compromising British coastal defenses. The machinery of deception had been more complex than anyone realized. Pemberton had used his position to commit systematic sabotage while appearing to be nothing more than a dedicated field supervisor. Dr. Fairweather's murder had been his desperate attempt to protect ongoing treason that had compromised British naval security for years. Chapter 10: Where All Lines Converge. Miss Marple accompanied Inspector Wallace to the Devon coast, where they found David Pemberton at the Clifftop Observation Station, surrounded by surveying equipment and radio transmission gear. His weathered face showed no surprise at their arrival. "I wondered when you'd work it all out," Pemberton said with something approaching relief. "Though I'm surprised to see Miss Marple here." Miss Marple approached carefully. "There's no need for further deception, Mr. Pemberton. We know about the systematic falsification, the foreign payments, and your murder of Dr. Fairweather." Pemberton nodded slowly. Edmund was going to ruin 20 years of careful work. Not just expose the data adjustments, but reveal my role in providing strategic information to Soviet maritime operations. 20 years of treason. Commander Morrison demanded. Prevention of war, Pemberton replied with conviction. Sharing accurate coastal defense information with both sides prevents military miscalculations that could lead to nuclear conflict. Miss Marple observed his continued certainty. Dr. Fairweather discovered your true purpose. Edmund was too good for the work we were doing. When he realized the systematic adjustments were deliberate sabotage of British naval defenses, he couldn't accept it. Pemberton explained the murder with chilling precision. I knew Edmund's habits, he always checked the basement archives when stressed. I prepared the weapon weeks in advance, knowing I might need to stop him from exposing our operation. And the others? No one else knowingly participated. They thought they were simply meeting ministry deadlines. Only I understood the true purpose. Miss Marple made her final observation. Mr. Pemberton, Dr. Fairweather was consulting solicitors about whistleblower protections. He was trying to stop the sabotage while protecting his colleagues from treason charges. Your murder may have been entirely unnecessary. For the first time, Pemberton's conviction wavered as he realized his careful justifications had been based on false assumptions. The case was closed, but its implications would resonate through government circles. The coastal survey would be completely redone, the department restructured, and new protocols established to protect scientific integrity in sensitive work. Miss Marple reflected that the most important survey had been the measurement of human character, revealing how institutional pressure, personal conviction, and moral confusion could combine to create tragedy, but also how individual conscience could ultimately prevail over systematic deception. 6 months later, Miss Marple received a letter from her great-nephew Raymond, who had remained with the restructured Ordnance Survey under new leadership. The department had been thoroughly reorganized, with new safeguards against both external pressure and internal compromise. Dr. Meridian had been retained after her cooperation with the investigation, though she now worked under strict supervision. Miss Thornfield had been promoted to chief cartographer, with a mandate to rebuild the department's reputation for absolute accuracy. Timothy Ashford had completed additional training and was showing promise as a specialist in verification procedures. Professor Blackwood had faced professional censure for his unwitting role in enabling the systematic falsification, but his cooperation with authorities and genuine remorse had limited the consequences. He had retired from consulting work and returned to pure academic research. David Pemberton had been convicted of murder and treason, sentenced to life imprisonment. The full extent of his 20-year campaign of strategic sabotage was still being assessed by military intelligence, but his activities had indeed compromised several crucial British naval operations. The case had become a cautionary tale within government circles about the dangers of institutional pressure that prioritized results over accuracy, and new protocols had been established to protect scientific integrity in strategically sensitive work. Miss Marple filed Raymond's letter carefully in her correspondence folder, reflecting on the human elements that had made this tragedy possible. Institutional pressure, personal ambition, ideological conviction, and simple moral confusion had combined to create a perfect storm of deception and ultimately, murder. But the case had also demonstrated the power of individual conscience, Dr. Fairweather's growing determination to expose the truth, Professor Blackwood's decision to end his unwitting complicity, and the younger staff members' commitment to accuracy despite external pressures. As she returned to her knitting in the peaceful surroundings of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected that the most important survey of all was the constant measurement of one's own moral position. In a world where institutional pressures could gradually compromise even the most well-meaning people, the ability to recognize when one had strayed from true principles remained humanity's most essential skill. The Ordnance Survey would recover its reputation through painstaking attention to accuracy and transparency. The coastal defenses would be properly mapped using genuine measurements. And somewhere, the spirit of Dr. Edmund Fairweather could rest knowing that his final act of conscience had ultimately served both truth and the national security he had died trying to protect. Miss Marple had always believed that precision in human observation was more important than precision in any scientific instrument. The case of Dr. Fairweather's murder had proven that belief once again, demonstrating that the most dangerous deceptions were often those that people told themselves about their own motivations and justifications. The final measurement had been taken, the true survey completed, and the territory of human character mapped once more with the careful accuracy that Miss Marple brought to all her investigations into the endlessly fascinating complexity of human nature. In the end, as always, truth had proved more precise than any instrument, and justice more accurate than any calculation. And that, Miss Marple reflected with satisfaction, was exactly as it should be.